Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. You can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Beer of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I'm posting the new episode a little early for a couple of reasons. First, I am off to Boston on Monday for the annual Bio Conference, where I'll be meeting with some of my member companies, pitching other companies on joining, and otherwise, working my business schmooze. In fact, June's going to have some crazy travel and a couple of heavy-duty meetings with FDA, but I got lots of episodes recorded, so you'll get your weekly fix. Don't worry. I just want to get a little bit ahead on this one. And the other big reason I'm posting today instead of Monday night or Tuesday morning, this is currently Sunday if you're listening in real time, is because it is Arthur Schick's birthday. And if you don't know who Schick is, well, it's not the fault of this week's guest. So our conversation this week is with Irvin Ungar, the author, editor, and publisher of Arthur Schick, Soldier in Art, which recently won the National Jewish Book Award for Visual Arts. Irvin's been championing Schick's work for more than 25 years, launching a Schick Society, giving presentations on Schick's work around the world, reissuing Schick's masterwork of a Hagaddah along with some other works of his, and overall trying to restore the reputation of a guy who was once one of the most famous artists in America. Arthur Schick was born 1894, died 1951, and his art spanned a bunch of different genres: illuminated text, miniature portraits, political cartooning, magazine illustration, the Hagaddah. There's a lot more. And at his heyday, like I said, he was one of the most popular artists in the world in the 30s and particularly the 40s once he moved to America. But he was largely forgotten by the time Irvin came across his work in the 80s, but really the 90s. And Soldier in Art, the new book, is an amazing introduction to Schick's work. It's got a series of essays by Irv and some other scholars, along with a gorgeous assortment of Schick's art. Now, I'd never heard of Schick before 2016 when a past guest, Harry Katz, who you may remember, told me about Irv's work championing Schick. And after reading Arthur Schick, Soldier in Art, I'm so glad I got this education. This is just another one of those great things that never would have come my way were it not for this podcast. See, the thing with Schick, and it's spelled S-Z-Y-K, not Schick like the razor. It's something I talk about with Irv during the episode. His art served higher ends, advancing peace, pushing for tolerance, pushing for the Jewish cause. But it's not just the message thing, because that can easily just turn into, oh, he was a propaganda artist. What intrigues me is the the synthesis of this absolutely gorgeous art and these, we'll say, archaic forms like illuminated text, and the message and how they both emerge from the same thing that attracted Irv to Arthur Schick's work, and that is the notion of the upstanding man behind it all. So this righteousness, not self-righteousness, but an actual belief in a moral imperative to improve the world that permeates Schick's work, and especially to hear Irv describe it and describe his own transformation through Schick. It's really, really interesting. And something that really captivates me. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know how I fixate on weird stuff like this. So today is Arthur Schick's birthday, June 3rd. And to help Irv celebrate it, I thought we'd get the episode up a little early. Now, we recorded this one on the Upper West Side. So as far as caveats go, New York traffic noise. That's one of those standard things. We also, I'll be honest, we spent less time talking about Irv and more time talking about Schick, which is understandable given that championing Schick is Irv's life work. But there's still aspects of Irv as a person I'd like to learn more about. I might get him on the show again sometime to talk about that non-Schick life. And we talked a little off mic about that in terms of where Schick ends and Irv begins. Still, it's great to talk to someone who's so passionate. At the same time, he did tell me, the guy who was cursing at the TV when the Golden State Warriors lost Game 5 to the Rockets, that was Irv, not Schick. Anyway, here's Irvin's bio. Irvin Ungar, a former pulpit rabbi and antiquarian bookseller, has devoted the past quarter century to scholarship relating to illustrator Arthur Schick. He has curated numerous Schick exhibitions worldwide, including those at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Library of Congress, and the New York Historical Society. He is the author of the National Jewish Book Award-winning Arthur Schick, Soldier in Art, publisher of the limited edition of The Schick Hagaddah, and producer of the documentary film Soldier in Art, Arthur Schick. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Irvin Ungar. How did you come to champion Arthur Schick?
Well, I made a critical decision at a certain point in my life to invest heavily financially in buying Arthur Schick's family archives and documents. And once I did that, I was all in. And then I said, because there was an exhibition on the horizon at the Spertus Museum in Chicago, and I decided that I was looking for a museum venue to host an important Schick event. And once the Spertus said they would have this exhibit, I knew I needed to buy these archives, and I had no money, and they were hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I woke up in the morning. I needed the archives to do the research for the exhibition. And since there were no books about Arthur Schick back in 1997, 98, I needed all the archives to be able to write the first book. So I woke up in the morning and I said to my wife, Marge, we need to take out a second mortgage on our house. All right, would you go along with that? My wife said yes. And then I went to my dad. Was
she awake at that point, or was it just whatever he says? I just got to get back to sleep.
I think she was half awake. Okay. And then I went to my dad, who lived in New Jersey. Dad was in his 80s and had a $150,000 home. And Dad agreed to lend me another $50,000. And the man I was buying the archives from, he agreed to take a third against my house. And I was all in. And that's when I made the commitment to say, yes, I'm going to really put my efforts forth to make this once very famous artist who was virtually forgotten, to make him famous again.
So I guess that should backtrack to, how did you discover Schick initially?
Well, when I was getting married back in the mid-'70s, I needed gifts for people in my wedding party. I found reproductions of Arthur Schick's Passover Hagaddah for sale at a bookshop. They were $18 a piece, I remember. I bought them for the people in my wedding party, and that's the first time I remember meeting Arthur Schick. I was 3 years old when Schick died in 1951. I first met him in the 1970s when I when I saw his art in his Hagaddah. That's how I came to meet Arthur Schick.
And what was it that grabbed you?
It was the colors. They jumped out at me, and I just thought it was brilliant. It was brilliant. And then I went on for the next 13, 14 years. I didn't think about Schick once in my profession. And then when I left what I was doing then and went into the rare book world to become an antiquarian bookseller, I rediscovered Arthur Schick. Schick was a book illustrator. I gravitated towards him, and then I was off and running.
And what makes his work special?
Oh, he's special because, first of all, I don't have an art background, but I just recognize what Schick's art as great art. I'm not quite sure what great art means, but to me, it was great. And then I discovered that this was an artist with a message, that there was always that his art was always against a tyranny and oppression and for justice and freedom. And I love that. And I love the idea that he was able to combine great art with great messages. That's what I think makes Schick special. And, well, there's more. There's far more than that. But
please, we've got time. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm off. Well, you know, what I was doing during that 13-year period between when I first discovered Schick and then as an antiquarian bookseller rediscovered him is I was a pulpit rabbi. And during that period of time, you know, I didn't have really time to think about Schick. In fact, I probably didn't have time to think at all. I was so busy. But I think it was my rabbinic training that taught me something like, you know, care about who you are and who your people are, and then use the best of that tradition to help make the world a better place. And so when I met Arthur Schick, I realized that here was an artist who sort of visualized through art. He articulated really what my own value system was. That is to use your art, as Schick did on behalf of the Jewish people, to be an artist who saw himself as hoping to elevate the prestige of the Jew in the world. That's how Schick, I think, saw a good part of his mission. But then he used the best of his value system as as an activist artist to also advocate for humanity at large. And what that tells me is that no matter who you are, whatever your tradition is, care about where you come from, who you are, and then whether you're a good Christian, a good Muslim, a good Jew, whatever, use the best of that tradition to contribute to the betterment of the world. And that to me was Arthur Schick. And that was me. And I felt like now I had someone who actually eventually grew to fall in love with. You know, to fall in love with a dead person who you never met is what's happened to me. And I think what helped that along the way is I met his daughter, Alexandra, when she was in her, I guess, late 60s. She and I were friends for 25 years, and she died about a year and a half ago. She was 94, and she and I became good buddies. And I got to know as much as I could about Schick, and I had a great relationship with her too. So that's in part.
Yeah. Why do you think he was forgotten?
Oh, you're going right to the sort of the heart of it.
I'll get to
what you need to know before you even asking the question, why do you think it was forgotten? The one thing to know is how famous Arthur Schick was. I mean, during his lifetime, I would dare say, and he died again in 1951, I would say there was no artist. There were artists, but he was one of the most famous artists in the world in the 1940s. And what I mean by famous, first of all, is that he was extremely well known in Poland, the land of his birth. He was really well known in the 20s in Paris. I mean, Schick went to the cafes, sometimes 2 cafes a night, and then they entertained back in his own home with his wife, Julia. And then after Paris, and some of the most expensive illustrated books in Paris in the 20s were by Arthur Schick. The Minister of Arts thought that Arthur Schick was the greatest illuminator in the past 400 years, since the 16th century. He was decorated by the French government. He was decorated by the Polish government in 1923 and 1931, respectively. He went to England. He was extremely well known in England. And then before coming to America in 1940, he spent a few months in Canada, where he was well recognized, and then came to America in 1940 to settle as an immigrant, but had even been here in the 30s for 7 months. And the American government decorated him with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal. That is decorated in 3 countries, Poland, France, United States, well known internationally. An artist who in 1931 was invited to Geneva by the League of Nations to illustrate the charter for the League of Nations, the only artist in the world. I mean,
when Norman Rockwell was illustrating the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, Schick was illustrating the covers of Collier's magazine. The circulation of the Saturday Evening Post, 3 million. The circulation of Collier's with Schick's covers, 2.5 million. Everyone saw Schick. Everyone knew Schick. He was well known. So now that's the context, I think, for answering your question. What happened? Yeah. Because what happened, I mean, it's not that I became interested in an artist and I set out to try to make this artist well known and famous. I was interested in an artist who was really famous, but virtually forgotten. So now to your question.
What happened?
I mean, it's a long preliminary. Ask me a question. You're going to get a whole narrative.
Again,
here.
The rabbinic background.
The rabbinic background.
Which we'll also get to, but yeah.
For sure. But, in 1951, when Schick died at age 57, why and how he died at age 57 and his life was cut short is another story. When he died at age 57 in 1951, Schick was not part of any school of art. Nor was there any school of Schick. Mm-hmm. And, Schick was a realist artist and the war was forgotten. The Holocaust wasn't being spoken about in terms of Schick's activism during World War II on behalf of European Jewry. So Schick was not, so art historians weren't really writing about Schick, not knowing where to place his art. Because if you look at his art, he's working in a style of illuminated manuscripts, Persian miniatures, Polish and Slavic folk art, Bezalel art from Palestine from the early 20th century, German expressionism. He combines all of them to his unique style. No one knew where to place Schick and no one dealt with it. And even when people wrote books about World War II political history, they left Schick out. When people wrote about great Jewish artists, they left Schick out. It's unbelievable how he was forgotten. So he dies in 1951, not part of any school of art. The family dismissed all the dealers working with Schick because they thought they would promote his art. But shortly after Schick died, a few years later, Schick's son, George, died. That was it. No family, no dealers to promote his art. No one writing about Arthur Schick. He's a miniaturist. His works are small. 6, 7 inches high by a few inches wide, sometimes a little bit larger. I mean, if some of his works were as big as Picasso's Guernica, everyone would know who Schick is. And I have a work that I can tell you about that I consider to be, Schick's Guernica. More about that perhaps later. In any case, he's a miniaturist. He's not part of any school of art. No dealers are working with him. It's hard to pronounce Zyk. How do you pronounce it? People call me on the phone. Is Zyk, Zizik? What is it? So you remember that. I mean, people I meet regularly who tell me, oh, I didn't know that was by Arthur Schick, and you look at his illustrated Andersen's Fairy Tales, which by the way is the most illustrated of any illustrator. And continuously in print. They didn't know that was by Arthur Schick, or they own his Hagaddah. Oh, that's by Schick? And you get all of these surprising things. The other thing is that people who know that Schick was a Jewish artist who did the Hagaddah or the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel didn't know that he was a political artist during World War II. And those who knew he was a political artist during World War II didn't know that he was an illustrator of close to 30 books and children's books. And those who knew he illustrated Andersen's Fairy Tales and the Rubaiyat and Canterbury Tales didn't know he did Jewish art. So no one really connected the great diversity and depth and the broad scope of what Schick dealt with. And so along comes Irvin Ungar, that's me, and I decide, wait a minute, this has got to stop. And the more people told me they didn't know who he was, the more it drove me to want to make him famous again. And so I think it's this whole combination of things, this perfect storm, to use a cliche, that really came together, that really drove Schick into virtual obscurity. And then, back in the late 1990s, that's when I got started. Any
sort of Gilgal process going on there where you feel like you were getting possessed by the spirit or something?
You ask about Gilgal and getting...
I prefer that over a Dybbuk, but go on.
Well, no, but I used to talk to Arthur Schick's daughter, visit her once or twice a year in Florida where she lived, and sometimes I'd talk to her, once every 2 weeks, and we would talk. I would meet with her, and the last few years of her life, she would say, Irv, my father's Dybbuk lives in you. And I'd go like, Alexandra, come on, she says, no, Irv, his spirit is speaking through you. And I go, Alexandra, I really am in love with your dad and I love you too. But, so anyhow, maybe I feel it's okay to really say that Schick lives through me. Look, I don't mind it because I live with him all the time in a way that's, He used to be at our dinner table. My wife and kids used to meet him all the time. I used to talk about him a lot, but they became quite patient and they understood.
I was going to ask, is there a point where they had oh God, he's going on about Schick. Could he just let it go?
No more Schick.
You
don't say, no, excuse me. But anyhow, you're careful. You pick your spots and,
you'll learn to read the room.
You learn how to do that. That's right.
Now, how does Schick's work evolve from the days in Poland to,
So he was born 1894 in Lodz, Poland. His father owned a textile mill. So clearly as a young child, he's seeing a lot of colors, and the Chinese trade route, which started in the Far East and made its way through two of the routes. One of them ended in Lodz, where Schick lived. So he saw a lot of colors, it was a very international city. Schick grew up with a whole idea of, German Protestants and Polish Catholics and Russian Orthodox and Jews all in this town of Lodz, and really a national town, and where Jews were about a third of the population. And so Schick had this national broad view. He, grew up in the upper middle class. So he wasn't like a ghetto Jew. He was very nationalistic in his thoughts and his approach and his accessibility to, the world in a way. But as a child, he went to a trade school. He didn't go to like a cheder, a Jewish school, a yeshiva. No, that wasn't where Schick, he probably learned his Jewish upbringing and Jewish knowledge. Maybe came more from both his mother and his father. Maybe a rabbi he met somewhere, but we don't know of him being in any Jewish school. As a teenager, his parents agreed in 1910 to send him off to Paris. And he studied in the Académie Julienne. And people quite often ask me, is the École de Beaux-Arts and the Académie Julienne. And, when Schick was there, Diego Rivera was a fellow student with his. So he's there for about 3.5 years in Paris. But we found records that indicated that he was only in about 12 classes over a 3.5-year period. So virtually self-taught in the Cluny, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, he went in the Louvre. Schick was finding art and discovering it and drawn to illuminated manuscripts, particularly. In any case, he returned from Paris. He wasn't very shortly enrolled in the school in Krakow, but only for a few months. There are some teachers who are known, but no one, Schick really is self-taught and it evolved from there. He began to become familiar. He traveled in 1914 to the Near East. It was in Constantinople, spent a lot of time in Palestine. So for about 6 months, he traveled abroad. He returned back. He was conscripted into the Russian army, during World War I. He fled, returned to Lodz, and that's probably how he survived the war. There's more about what happens afterwards, and I can continue to ramble, but I'll let you ask the questions to keep me focused.
Well, it is that question of how his art grew or changed. How do you see it in terms of what were the milestones?
So the milestones are excellent. So in after World War I is over and the Polish-Soviet War is over, and by the way, in 1919, 1920, Arthur Schick was the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Soviet Union. A Jew, the head of Polish propaganda. Mm-hmm. How's that? But he takes up, after the war's over, he goes to live in Paris, so 1921. And in Paris, he's illustrating books. He has a style. But in 1927, Schick in his diary, and I once owned his diary, it was written in beautiful cursive Russian. Mm-hmm. And in that diary, Schick wrote in 1927, "This is the year that I will become the master." And it is then that his style of detail, working in the style of these miniaturists of the 16th century, the brilliant explosion of color and of detail and of precision and of rich history and art coming together in a monumental document known as the Statute of College, which is virtually like the Jewish Magna Carta. It is about rights bestowed upon Jews by a Polish king in the 13th century. And Schick wanted to illuminate this charter, these rights bestowed to minorities. And he wanted to do this in the 20th century because he wanted Jews of Europe to be recognized. And if they could be empowered by a government, the government would be stronger. And Schick wanted to use his art to move history from one period to another, that is from the 13th century to the 20th. And he wanted to do this through the great art of illumination. He wanted people to pay attention to the genius of his art. It's funny because Schick always said, art is not my aim, it's my means. Mm-hmm. So But that's the one thing about Schick. When you look at his art, to try to hold simultaneously in your hands both the great messages and the great art, both at the same time. And I think 27 was that year when you began to see the greatness of Schick that carried through from the 20s to the 30s, in the mid 30s when he produced his magnum opus in Jewish circles, that Passover Hagaddah, and then how he then in the 40s applied that great detail of illuminated manuscripts to caricature and cartoon to virtually go on to become, in my mind, the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. But Schick's really movement to become the mature, fashioned, exquisite, brilliant artist was really in the around 1926, 27. In Paris, where he was living for about a dozen years.
What grabbed him about illumination?
I think he was drawn to illumination because, an illuminator is one who illuminates a text. He illustrates a text to enlighten one, to give one more meaning. It's very clear. And Schick always wanted messages to be clear. Abstract art would be nothing for Schick. It wouldn't even be considered, he would have considered it art, but not for Schick. Yeah. I think illuminated manuscripts delivered the medium by which he could deliver the clearest message to people. Schick never wrote about his art. He never described his art. He never said what he was doing. The art itself was understood. I mean, when it appeared in Esquire magazine, in the 40s, just the full page of Schick's art was there. It wasn't used to illustrate some article someone had written, nor when it was there an article about Schick's art. It would just be there. Yeah. And that was the way it was wherever it appeared. Only once do I know where Schick actually wrote the description of a work of art.
Yeah, how much is that a hindrance? How much did he ultimately, leave behind his documents?
Well, he had a diary. He's quoted in magazines through numerous interviews in newspapers and in magazines and journals in the United States. There's numerous interviews. So we know what his thinking is. We know what his thinking is about fascism, about Hitler, about the Jewish people. We know where he,
but those are the big topics.
Those are the big topics. Those are the big topics. But about individual works of art, the work is the narrative. That is, Schick's art was the narrative.
And how comfortable was he shifting from doing miniatures, as you said, into illustration is very different. Illustration, some of the artists and cartoonists I record with describe their work as printer's instructions, basically.
Okay. All right.
Like it's art, but it's meant for reproduction. That's different than art as art. Did that give him any issues, as it were, or was he pretty conversant in what it meant to be illustrating for a magazine versus for a small
here's Schick.
canvas?
First of all, yes, Schick illustrated. He did illustrations of political messages. He did illustrations for books. Yes, Schick was an illustrator. He was a caricaturist. He was a cartoonist. But above all, Schick saw himself as an illuminator. And an illuminator was, for Schick, the great artist. Schick once said, I am but a Jew praying in art. He saw himself as an art. And in fact, when you look at a great number of his works where you see self-portraits of Arthur Schick, you will see him holding a palette in his hand. An illustrator doesn't use a palette.
Right.
And so you know that Schick saw himself as a great artist. There's no question about it. And he let, sort of his humility would always ooze out in a way because you would see just the way he presented himself. So yes, but it's like when you call Schick an illustrator, it's like calling Chippendale a carpenter. He's more than a carpenter. Yeah. Michelangelo is more than a painter. Schick is more than any of those.
Yeah. I just wonder the different set of demands illustration places on you, knowing that he's good at making, true art, making illustrations a different sort of practice technically. And did it show any challenge for him, or was he pretty
I
conversing?
don't think so. First of all, Schick worked really fast. He could knock things off really rapidly. Even his most complicated works of art, really detailed, took him a week or less. I mean, and if we had one particular example, I could, just show you that. I know this because I've interviewed people who were both commissioned Schick to do his art and who were his
agent, and I've interviewed them the same time at different times about the same piece. They gave me the same answer, so I know exactly how long it took him. So he could, but he, a lot of his work was not even commissioned, so he wasn't worried. He did what he wanted to do. He wasn't worried, and he was syndicated by the New York Post and the Chicago Sun, and became an artist for PM. Replacing Dr. Seuss during the war, and Roland Kirby at the New York Post, and they kept running him and running him. I don't think he was worried about the demands that would be on him. The covers he did for Collier's and for Time and elsewhere. I don't think Schick was worried about anybody's demands. He was going to accomplish what I think they approached Schick and said, do what you think you'd like to do. And I think that's what he did. And by the way, no preliminary drawings and sketches. He would just do the single work of art, and that would be it.
Yeah. It's sort of amazing when you see that level of facility in art that good, that somebody's, capable of doing it. And
I've been interviewed by on radio before.
Oh, sure.
And I've always
feel bad. I'm just kidding.
What the point I want to make here is I wish that the people listening to this, can see visually what I'm thinking, but they can go and see it on the internet.
I'll put a couple of images in the show notes. Also, I'll embed a couple of pictures in there. But yeah, going through the Soldier and Art collection and just seeing the work in the various phases and incarnations he was working is just sort of mind blowing. And again, it's someone who I didn't know prior to our friend Harry connecting us.
Yeah.
So, because it reminds me a little, although he retained fame in other countries, of Stefan Zweig, mainly, he was a writer who did fiction, short fiction, and biographies, who was the biggest thing in the world in the 30s and 40s, fled in 34 from Austria, ends up killing himself in 42 out of depression over the war, but vanishes from the Anglo world. Apparently in France, he stayed popular all those decades, but it took 60 years before he was sort of rediscovered in America and England, where it was, he was actually a really, really good writer. And he was the most popular writer in the world for that stretch.
Well, can I tell you something about popular in 1940s? Yeah. Two things I want to tell you. First, I want to tell you about there's a really well-known, well-respected art critic, Donald Cuspit. He just wrote an article for Art Forum, I think back in February it appeared, where he's talking about where he says that in the 1940s, there are well-known artists, Hopper and Jackson Pollock and Ben Shahn. He says probably the best of them all is a guy you've probably never heard of named Arthur Schick. That just appeared in Art Forum. Yeah. And I want to take you back to the 1940s for a second. We're in right now, we're in an apartment in Upper West Side here in New York. But just imagine we were sitting in this apartment in the 1940s, and you and I, we got up, we had breakfast together, or we're meeting for coffee or something. I'll tell you something, and I'm there before you arrive at this restaurant, and I open up the New York Post, and there I see Arthur Schick's art in the New York Post. And by the way, if I missed it that day, it'd be there 2 days later, because like in 43 to 44, there was almost 100 works of Schick in the New York Post. That's how my morning begins. I open up the New York Post, and I see Arthur Schick's art. And then I decided, wait a minute, excuse me, I've got to go make a phone call, but I don't reach for my cell phone. Of course, it's 1940, so I go to the payphone. But before I can make that call, I have to get a Manhattan telephone directory. And I reach for the telephone directory. You know whose art's on the cover of that telephone directory? Arthur Schick. But if we had breakfast that morning in Brooklyn, I reach for the Brooklyn directory. Different work of Arthur Schick is on the Brooklyn directory. That's the morning. And then we have our breakfast. We go on. And what are you doing for the rest of the day? You ask me. I'm thinking I'm going to go to a gallery because, I like art. And I decided I'm going to, New York's the center, pretty much the center of the art world. Knoedler's, Wildenstein. These are great art galleries. And I think I'll go see a Picasso show. But wait a minute. Picasso's not in town this week. But guess who's there this week? It's Arthur Schick. So in the afternoon, I go over and I see a Schick show. And by the way, 1941, there were 25 shows of Schick just in New York. Talk about famous. This is New York, the center of the art world. So I go to the exhibit of Schick in the afternoon, at Knoedler's or Wildenstein. And afterwards, I'm really a little bit tired. So I go back home and decide I'm going to do my correspondence for the day. When people wrote letters, they put stamps on envelopes. They actually sometimes put even
poster stamps on envelopes. These are like Easter seals, and I reach into my drawer to send out some mailings to get caught up. And I pull out a bunch of poster stamps, and they're by Arthur Schick. Some of them had to do with the emergency committee to save the Jewish people of Europe. And you'd put those on a stamp. Or some were the Four Freedom stamps after 41 when Schick did the Four Freedom stamps. And I put those in envelopes and I send them out. And now that's my afternoon. That's my day. But I forgot to eat since I had that coffee for breakfast. So I decided I'm going to go over to Times Square. I'm going to go to Nedick's. I'm going to go to there on 7th Avenue, I think on 42nd Street, where you can get your orange soda and your hot dog. And my neck is tired. And I look up and there I see this huge billboard in Times Square. And it's of Abraham Lincoln and it's by Arthur Schick. Huge billboard. That is a day for me in the 1940s in New York City of Schick. He's everywhere. And that's our day.
How was his culture shock coming to America?
Oh, well, Schick,
I mean, the success is one thing, but how did he personally deal with
No, I don't think Schick had culture shock at all. Yeah. In fact, he came to America, he immigrated in 1940 for good, but he actually came in the very year that Hitler came to power in 1933. Schick was invited by American congressmen to come to the United States. And why was he invited? Because there was going to be an exhibition of works on freedom, on Schick's works on freedom, in the very year Hitler came to power at the Library of Congress. Yeah. And so Schick was invited to come to the United States in December of 33. It was a cold, snowy day. Schick arrived. He's photographed at the dock with his beautiful wife, Julia. And Schick arrives, and while he's here, that's when he's decorated with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal. He's here for 7 months. So I think Schick had time, because he lived in Poland, because he lived in France, because he knew what was going on in England. And then Schick was able to adopt and assimilate both cultures and peoples and language. And then he went back to Europe in 1934, and what he did when he went back to Poland is pretty spectacular. But then he ended up coming back in 1940. And I think he adjusted well. He took an apartment on the Upper West Side, 74th Street near Riverside, a penthouse apartment, and then ultimately moved to one of the most exclusive apartments on the East Side on Madison 65th. He did quite well. All by art, as what his daughter said, they never had anything, but ultimately Schick ended up with a 10-acre estate in New Canaan, Connecticut. So he did fine. Yeah. But I think he adjusted well because he could speak so many languages and felt so comfortable, and because he lived well within his own skin. He was not afraid to say what he thought, and his art certainly showed that.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. Just again, going with the example of Zweig, he was someone who was incredibly cultured, Austrian, the coffee houses of the pre-World War I era.
Yes.
And America is this vulgar thing. And I wondered if Schick had any similar thing, or if he was, again, like you said, much more comfortable as a human being, as, this is Europe, this is America, this is.
Yes, but look, Schick loved a lot of countries, but he also was willing to attack them for what he saw as the inequities in their society. Sure. So while he may have been comfortable living in America, he was uncomfortable with its racism here. And so he was willing to take a stand and did a number of works in the 40s advocating for African Americans, hating the discrimination that was in the American Armed Forces, where blacks and whites were forced into segregated units. And Schick created magnificent artworks attacking racism. So while he adjusted to the culture and to the place where he was, his adjustment was to feel comfortable, and his comfort level was to also stand up to the inequities he saw. And so he could live comfortably in a way because he was comfortable with himself.
Yeah. And those pro-African American, or the ones, attacking lynching and things like that, were those just blew my mind when I was reading the book. I was like, wow, that guy, it wasn't just a one note, message that he had. So
you could place his ninth drawing he did of the black soldier who came back from World War II. Schick did this setting in 1949. He did this drawing you just referred to about the lynching. This black soldier is on his knees. His pants are tattered. His arms are tied behind him in a rope. And I say he's a hero because Schick painted a purple heart on his chest and a cross also from his neck. And over his right shoulder is the Ku Klux Klan looking at this kneeling black soldier tied with the rope. And there's an expression in the New Testament in the book of Luke where Jesus Jesus is purportedly to have said, forgive them, O Lord, for they know not what they do. Schick's caption on this work of art is, do not forgive them, O Lord, for they know what they do. And this was published in the Sunday Compass, I believe, the newspaper at the time. So he, these images, and I'm just rambling for a second, but these images could be placed in our own time. That's the thing about Schick. He responded to the immediacy of the hour, but yet he also said, I create my cartoons, and Schick didn't see himself as a cartoonist. But when he said this, he said, I create my cartoons for permanence. Because evil and injustice is always going to be with us. And even though he worked really rapidly and with such incredible detail, they spent the time on those because he really wanted his art to last, because as I said, the messages in them are really not only for that time, but for all time, So.
What do you think your greatest achievement's been in terms of championing Schick?
Oh, my greatest achievement?
Yeah.
Oh man, I just, I suppose my greatest achievement is reintroducing Schick to the world and to see that he's really being talked about. He's being talked about in Poland, where people are feeling empowered to have exhibitions and to create publications. I feel that's a really great achievement. I feel that when I go into high schools where kids don't even know about World War II history or art, and I talk about them, and they come out of my PowerPoint presentation, go, damn, man, that's great shit. Schick.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, but I think that people, I think the greatest achievement, I don't think there is any one. I think
I wasn't sure if there was an exhibition that you said, wow, this is a big turning point.
The turning points are, I've always wanted to have an exhibition in New York City after having major exhibits in other venues. And so this exhibit to New York Historical Society this past fall and winter was a big achievement. But every exhibition, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2002, that was the first one-man art exhibition ever there, and the publication that came out of it and the website they created, that was a great achievement. It's like in the Passover Hagaddah, there's a song called Dayenu. If this had happened, that would have only been enough. Well, if there had only been an exhibit at the Holocaust Museum, that would have been enough. But there was an exhibit at the Library of Congress, and that was called Arthur Schick, Artist for Freedom, the first exhibition of the new millennium. If that had only happened, Dayenu, that would have been enough. But then I curated an exhibit at the most prestigious museum in Germany, at the Deutsches Historisches Museum, the German Historical Museum in Berlin. And man, that's a story. How did that happen? Yeah. That's a story. But if that had only happened, and they did a publication, and if that only happened, that would have been enough. So I guess it's just all together. I don't know. I feel like, just the idea that the greatness of who the Schick is, that he can be exposed to the world and bringing him back. I consider that, we're taking this trip together,
You became an antiquarian bookseller before starting the Schick? Yeah,
I left the rabbinate after 13 years, and in 1987, when I left the rabbinate, and shortly thereafter I entered, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew that
people of the book, though, you had to stay with.
Oh, people of the book. Well, I had a library, but I was not a book collector. Mm-hmm. I didn't grow up in a business household. I didn't have any money, and I certainly never apprenticed with a bookseller, nor went to library science school. I had all the right ingredients for starting to become a bookseller. No inventory, no money, no background experience, nothing in business. But I did, and I made it, and so I worked. So for 30 years, I've been an antiquarian bookseller, handling books in all fields, but I began to specialize in historic Judaica books by and about Jews, both in America and abroad, that mattered. And then I evolved, where Arthur Schick became more and more part of what I do. I started to collect his art and built the largest collection in the world of his art and archives and documents, and also handled pieces that I sold. And I became totally involved. I wore two hats. I had my business, and then I also was a curator of a nonprofit, the Arthur Schick Society. And so scholarship and business went hand in hand for me. Neither one of them drove the other. It's just that they were simultaneous. But I became genuinely interested in Schick, and, eventually I sold my collection. And, Ben Franklin has an expression where he said, I'd be dishonest if I didn't say that as a result of doing good, I also did well. So,
That's sort of
that's the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
And what drove you into the rabbinate to begin with?
Oh, that's another story. Well,
which again, I don't want to get too personal, but
it's okay. Sort of I was majoring in math and economics. I didn't like either. My father thought it was a good idea. And then December 1969 came along, and the first draft lottery was held. And my mom didn't think it was a good idea for me to go to Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah, she didn't think that was such a good idea. And so she said, let's talk to the family rabbi. And the family rabbi actually suggested that maybe I should look into rabbinical school, because there were deferments. They're called 4D, for divinity. And so, I didn't want to be a rabbi. It was the first thing from my mind. But I did get an interview with a rabbinical school, and I sat before two rabbis, the dean and the associate dean, and they said, Mr. Ungar, tell me, why would you like to go to rabbinical school? And I says, oh, rabbis, I've always wanted to be a rabbi. And they looked at me and said, Ungar, you're full of shit, but when we like you, we'll take you. So I entered rabbinical school. And when I did in 1970, I absolutely loved it. I really, at that stage that I really learned to love learning. I really didn't understand what that meant before. And I became a really good student. And when I was in school, I thought, geez, when I finish, I could do anything I want. And I thought, I love this so much that I decided that, I'm going to become a rabbi in a congregation. And, I went to graduate school at NYU and finished my master's there. And ultimately, I went on to even go to a Protestant seminary and studied New Testament and got another degree there, and went to a psychoanalytic institute and finished that program. All the things I thought I needed to be a good rabbi and counselor and educator and speaker and all of that stuff. And I think all of that training, that's what prepared me for Arthur Schick. So after I left the rabbinate, that's what I mentioned earlier, that all of this, I think, went into the idea that if a guy like Arthur Schick ever came along, I'd know who he was. And I think that, to me, was the best part of all of my training and experiences. Even though the rabbinate, I had great joys, but also it was really draining. And while I thought I was a good rabbi, it was a good time to leave. And hence, a whole new world opened up for me.
Mm-hmm. Do you have concrete examples of how the training helped your work on Schick?
Yes, it's the most important thing was it helped me develop my own value system as a Jew and as a sort of a person of the world, and it helped me foster a sense of real identity and what's important, and the ability to take a stand and the ability to stand up. And I think those things that trained me, I used my tongue to wag in front of a congregation, and while I may have written, about articles of social justice for a local newspaper, from time to time, and not trained in the art world, but boy, when I saw Schick, I realized that there was a whole different world, and I think it was the words and the concepts that formed me to bring me to Schick.
Yeah, how much art world training did this entail? Well,
the only thing is, as I look back, my most favorite class in undergraduate school was a class in art history. One class that I took, I had to memorize all these slides of every artist, and that I really enjoyed that class. Maybe it's because a friend of mine told me to take it, and I really enjoyed it. But there was no way I was going to pursue a world of art, just like there was no way I was going to rabbinical school. And that's what life is. You just get thrown some curves, and then you just make the best of it, and then you make changes, and you get frightened for the next stage, and then you'd embrace it, and then you go for it. And it really wasn't until I consciously decided to invest those several $100,000 and go into debt that I really consciously made a decision of what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And that was, I was going to be committed to Schick. And that's because all these other things were sort of influenced by other things, that were out of your control. And, it's like I tell young people when I talk to them in high schools and stuff like that, is that, life is about having good luck and bad luck. And I think it's minimizing the bad but being prepared for when the good luck comes along, you can take advantage of it. So I was prepared. I was ready. So if something happened, I could say, yeah, I'm going to go for it. And I think I think Schick would embrace every opportunity to get his art and his messages in front of whatever the audience was.
What would you ask him? One question.
That's really a great question. Well, here's what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'd call him up and say, Mr. Schick, I think if I saw him enough times, I think we'd be on the first name basis. He'd be calling me Irvin. I'd probably be calling him Arthur, although it's hard to imagine that. And I know that I would have on my mind an agenda. I'd go over to his place and I'd hang out on 74th Street, or I'd go on his place, or I'd go to New Canaan, Connecticut, up to his house. And I'd go there for one thing to ask him, and I'd end up spending 2 to 3 hours with him talking about a whole bunch of stuff. There's a woman in New York City. I do that with her all the time. I love this woman. I embrace her. This is a woman in her 80s, and we just go there, and the whole world opens up. So I just think that every time I go, there'd be something else I'd want to ask him. I guess maybe I'm stalling on that one question.
Still, if you had a single question.
If I had that one single question to ask him, well, I can tell you, it wouldn't be what did you have for breakfast. It wouldn't be who cuts your hair, because he was relatively bald. But I would probably be curious of what kind of art he would, if he were today.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to have an insight into kind of art that would be coming out and what would be coming in the papers today. What would he have to say about the Middle East? What position would he take on leadership in the world? How would he see the United States today? How would he paint the fabric of America today?
Mm-hmm.
How would he do that? The problem with asking him the question is, I think I do know what the answers would be. I think I do know what he would say. But when people ask me, what do you think Schick would say? I'd say, look at his art. What do you think he would say?
Yeah.
It's hard to speak for someone else. But boy, we need more Arthur Schicks today. And I think that the art world is changing. I think there's a new period entering of activist art. That's the next level. It's evolving. We're seeing that around us. There's things that are happening, but that doesn't just come from me. There are other people writing this. I'm sort of mimicking what I'm hearing and sensing, but I'm not sure what that one question would be, because once I'm there, there'd be 10 more questions that'd be more important than the first one I started out with.
That's what conversation is. Did he ever get to Israel? You mentioned he'd been to Palestine.
Yes.
But did he get there after independence?
He didn't. He was there only in 1914. And, after the war was over, in 45, so he died in 51, Schick had a heart condition that prevented him from going a lot of places. So he didn't make it back to Palestine. He never went back to Poland either. So no, never went to Israel. But his wife, Julia, wrote in her memoirs that when the day that Israel was created as a state, May 14th, 1948, Schick broke down and cried. That was the second time she saw him cry in his life. The other time, she said, was when he learned that his mother had been somehow taken from the ghettos of Lodz and killed somewhere in one of the camps. He didn't know where. But also he cried when Israel was created, and he saw those who fought for its independence as if they were his own children, she wrote. So, yeah. I don't know. Did I answer your question? No.
Yeah. Yes. I was just did he get there after independence?
Never went back.
But
I think Israel was always present. He did quite a bit of art dealing with the British and with the Arabs of Palestine. Mm-hmm. I should say something about that. You should be very straightforward, because your audience should hear directly the way it is. And that is that, the remarkable thing about Arthur Schick is that he embraced many peoples. And I mentioned that he would stand up to them where he thought they were wrong. He loved America, attacked its racism. He loved Great Britain because it was the forefront of fighting against the Nazis. But he really didn't like Britain because of the white papers and the restrictions they placed on immigration to Palestine, both during the war and shortly before the creation of statehood. So he took a real strong stance against the British, even though he had embraced them. The same thing with Poland. He loved Poland. He loved its people. He loved the nationalism of Poland. But when they became anti-Semitic, when he thought the government switched to that, he took a strong stand against them. And the same thing with America, America and its racism. He was willing to, the Jewish community, he loved the Jewish community and embraced them, but where he thought they weren't doing enough to rescue European Jewry, he stood up against them. So he was willing to take a stand. With regard to the Middle East and to the Arabs of Palestine, Schick thought it was just that there should be a state of Israel, and he stood by them. He loved Israel and its concept. But what's really interesting is at the time that Schick is creating artwork, which is attacking the British for their support of the Arab countries and their Bevin and their foreign minister and their mandate over Palestine. in 1948, in the same year Israel was fighting for its independence, really in a world removed, the Dutch invade Indonesia. And, Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. Schick creates a work of art attacking the Dutch for their oppression of the Muslims in Indonesia. The work of art is called Dutch Christmas in Indonesia. It's published on Christmas Eve in New York. What I'm saying is that Schick was able, while he was dealing with what's going on in the Middle East, the Muslims are being oppressed in another part of the world, and he was willing to stand up on their behalf with his love, Arthur Schick. This was a man who just acted in a way that he took a stand, and what he saw was just. And that's the way he conducted his life. He had an allegiance to all places, and yet it's like he became an immigrant to America. He's an immigrant here. Was an immigrant. He became an American citizen, in 1948. But if you go back to when he arrived in 1940 and was creating artwork, and in 41, before America was in the war, Schick's first cover for Collier's magazine appeared in November of 1941. It's a fabulous piece. It's a historic poker game between Hitler and Ivan of Russia. It's a tremendous image, and I could describe it in great detail, for your listeners. But what's even equally amazing to me is when you opened up the cover of Collier's, a small piece of paper would fall out. It's called a broadsheet. It had red ink on it. It was a message from Arthur Schick to the people of America in 1941. It's before America's in the war, and Schick has been here only a few months. And in this message, Schick writes, what a privilege it is. He says, you have no idea what a privilege it is for me as an immigrant to America to create this artwork for the American people. He says, my son is a soldier fighting with de Gaulle and the Free French somewhere in North Africa. I don't know where he is exactly, but someday I hope to become a citizen of America. And it is such a privilege for me to create this for the American people. That to me, that's Arthur Schick. I don't even know how I got to this point with you, Gil, and answering this, but I needed to tell this because your listeners need to know. In a day when we're talking about immigrants and their contributions to America, and Schick was so proud. And I know where I was going with this. It was that becoming an immigrant to America, Schick did not give up his love of Poland. He did not give up his love of the Jewish people and the land of Israel. As an immigrant, he didn't have to give up what he identified with all in. Yes, you can embrace it, but you can embrace many peoples and many lands and many cultures. And as a true immigrant, you can embrace that country and love it, but you can criticize it. And so Schick felt comfortable. It's getting back to your idea of comfortability. That's, in this book that I wrote, Arthur Schick, Soldier and Art, maybe you were going to ask me about it. I don't know. But in it, and I will say it though, but it won the National Jewish Book Award this
Congratulations.
year, so I'm really happy about that. But in it, I wrote an essay, and because, first I came to Arthur Schick because of the great colors, but then I saw the messages in this art, and I love that. And then I went back and embraced the art itself because I thought that maybe I was shortchanging the genius and greatness of his art. And that was my next level. But then I realized that there was a third level, and that was that behind the great art and the great messages stands Arthur Schick, the great man. Mm-hmm. And that's the essay in my book. Yeah.
You never tried painting?
I never tried painting.
I'm just assuming.
Never tried painting.
Is there a lost work of Schick's?
Yes.
That you'd love to find?
Yes.
Okay, because I know some of the ones in here are reproductions of printings, but are there also ones that you can't even find a reproduction of that, oh my God, if only we had...
Yes, it had that original. Yes. Yeah. I think it's the amazing, Schick illustrated both the Declaration of Independence of the United States, which is now at the Library of Congress, so we know where that is, but he also illustrated the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, or sometimes known as the Proclamation of the Establishment of the State of Israel, which, by the way, he used to hang side by side in his own home in 1940, Israel and America side by side. It is that original work of art of the Israel Declaration that I have no idea where it is. Mm. I do know when it's sold and who sold it back in the late 1950s, early 60s, but don't know where that is.
And I assume you've had that as your holy grail / white whale for a long time.
I think a lot of people would be interested in that.
What brings you to New York?
I'm here in New York for a couple of reasons. I'm here because this week because I had written this book, and I was given this award by the Jewish Book Council. I was here to give a 2-minute pitch in front of people who'd come from Jewish book festivals and other book festivals and Jewish centers and other places from around the United States, and a whole series of authors, Jewish authors or authors about Jewish books are paraded before them, where you give a 2-minute spiel about your book, and then they decide during the course of the year if they're going to bring you to their communities to help promote your book and to speak to their audiences. So one of the reasons I came to New York was to promote the book. And the second reason I'm here, sort of as bookends, is that next week there's an exhibition opening at the New York Historical Society of Enduring Ideals, Rockwell, Roosevelt, and the Four Freedoms. And since Arthur Schick saw himself as FDR's soldier in art, he signed a work of art to Eleanor Roosevelt in that fashion, to Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, from Arthur Schick, FDR's soldier in art. And since Schick was, illuminated, Rockwell's, FDR's, Arsenal of Democracy speech, and Schick saw himself as a fighting artist, during the war. His art is integral to any discussion about Rockwell, Roosevelt, and the Four Freedoms. Schick also illustrated the Four Freedoms. So I'm here because, this exhibit is opening on May 30th, and they published a book, which I have in front of me, called Enduring Ideals, Rockwell, Roosevelt, and the Four Freedoms. And I'm happy to announce that, I was asked to write an essay about Arthur Schick, that's in this, in the catalog. It's called Arthur Schick, Immigrant Artist as FDR's Soldier in Art, and has like 20 illustrations of Schick in color right in the middle of the Rockwell book. So yes. Anyhow,
Was there a rivalry?
Oh, no, I don't know of any rivalry. If you ask,
how aware were they of each other?
Well, I can imagine that Schick knows that Rockwell's doing this Saturday Evening Post covers because he's doing the Collier's covers at the same time, and Schick would have known everybody who's around, and everybody would know Schick. That's just the way it was. It's very visual. I don't know of any correspondence or any meetings between the two, but everyone knew Schick.
Yeah, that would be my,
yes.
I suppose if I had the weird one question thing, or if I was going to pull the Tom Stoppard, fictionalizing two people who should have met even if they didn't meet, I think Schick and Rockwell would be one of those pairings just to see who these two men were.
Yeah. There's a lot in common between the two. By the way, while their art was on Saturday Evening Post and Collier's covers at the same time, and they both illustrated the Four Freedoms, they were both born in 1894, the same year.
Oh, I didn't realize.
And Rockwell was born in New York City, in the city that Schick was destined to come to. There's one other interesting fact about Arthur Schick's art. In the 1930s, around 1930 in Paris, Schick illustrated a whole series called Washington and His Times. It's a whole series of paintings, 38 paintings, describing George Washington and the American Revolution. Well, in 1935, the president of Poland purchased these from Arthur Schick, and he gave them to FDR as a gift, to create almost closer relations between, Poland and America on the eve of World War II. So those works of art were given to Roosevelt, and, they were hanging in the White House when Roosevelt gave his famous Four Freedoms speech in January of 1941. So I like to say to people is, do you know whose art of freedom, 38 paintings, were hanging in the White House when Roosevelt gave his Four Freedoms speech? Arthur Schick. And, you know how Schick learned about them? Because Eleanor Roosevelt said to him, I guess maybe a cocktail party or somewhere, she said to him, Mr. Schick, we have you hanging in the White House. And he said, Mrs. Roosevelt, I hope not. And, so in any case, and then those paintings were then, later in 41, were transferred to the FDR, library in Hyde Park, the first presidential library, in the United States. And so, actually in June, I'm going to be there, give a talk. Yeah.
Awesome. So maybe I'll come up for that one too.
June 16th.
You're still discovering work of Schick's?
Oh, yeah. Still discovering works of Schick. Absolutely. Yeah. And, there's still works out there, and I'm still surprised, and I'm always going to be surprised by what I find. I mean,
are they later? Do they tend to be later era or early stuff? Is it just all over his career?
Still find Paris pieces. Most of his Paris pieces are in the U.S., actually. Almost all of them.
Yeah, it makes sense with World War II, et cetera, people were going to be moving stuff
one
out
of his
the country.
major collectors was a man in New York named Harry Glemby, and Glemby used to travel to Paris for Schick shows, and whatever didn't sell or he got there early, he bought everything and brought it back to New York. Mm-hmm. So a lot of his Paris pieces, but I find pieces of all eras in Schick's work, and things still come on the market, and I'm still looking and still buying. And
there's never a forgery issue? Well,
there are forgeries.
Oh, really?
Schick. Yes, there are. I had 4 thick binders of Schick forgeries, and well familiar with them. I used to discuss them with a biographer of Schick named Joseph E. Unsell, who wrote a wonderful biography, Arthur Schick, artist, Jew, and Pole. And I used to discuss them with Schick's daughter, and we all independently would all come to the same conclusion. And it's like the book Blink. You just sort of see it in a snap second. You know it's by or not by Schick. And so yeah, and I'm consulted by many places about that.
Stay in touch with congregants from your old days?
Not too many, but yes, I do have some good friends from the days when I was a rabbi in Forest Hills. I have a friend or two, and I still stay in touch with fraternity brothers from a long time ago. So yeah.
Was this the Forest Hills Jewish Center where Schick has the?
Oh, that's a good observation. Yeah, Schick created the Ark, the holy Ark that holds the Torah scrolls in them. Mm-hmm. He created them for the Forest Hills Jewish Center, and in addition to 2 elaborate menorahs and eternal light. But I was a rabbi across the street at another synagogue. And I didn't really think much about Schick then either, because I told you when I was a rabbinate, I didn't think I would have gone in, but wouldn't have put 2 and 2 together. But they're
still there, right?
The Ark is still there. I hope it'll be preserved, because I know they're planning to sell the building there. So we'll see.
Hmm. Judaism versus Jewishness.
Yes.
Schick sounds more culturally Jewish than practicing Jewish.
Okay. So Schick about whether he was an observant Jew or versus religious Jew. He could be religious and have a fervor and a feeling without being observant in terms of the rituals. Schick was what I believe, I know, Schick was not an observant Jew, but a religious Jew. Schick felt passionately and deeply about his culture, about his people, about his Jewishness. And that was, he, in his Passover Hagaddah, he said a sentence I said before, I am but a Jew praying in art. If I have succeeded in any measure, if I've gained the power of reception among the elite of the world, I owe it all to the teachings, the traditions, and the eternal virtues of my people. Schick felt deeply tied to his tradition and to his people. But I'll tell you something about Schick's religiosity, because this will show you another way that you can approach this. I was in Jerusalem back in 2008. I remember because I published a very limited edition of his Passover Hagaddah, which is a whole other story. But I'm there exhibiting it. It's an illuminated manuscript of combining both art and calligraphy, both in Schick's hand. Again, I mentioned it's this magnum opus. It's a genius of creation. I dare say. And an art historian has written about comparing Schick's art there as if it was Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Mm-hmm. It is this elevating, magnificent, otherworldly feel about it. Anyhow, I'm exhibiting this new edition of Arthur Schick's Passover Hagaddah that I created. I'm exhibiting it in Jerusalem, and I'm there at a table with it open, and a man walks up to me in a black coat, a long black coat, the blackest black coat you've ever seen, and a black beard, the longest black beard, and a black hat. It is so black. And he walks up to me and he says to me in perfect English, expecting maybe Yiddish, I wouldn't understand. In perfect English, he says to me, that's the Hagaddah of Arthur Schick, isn't it? And I'm like blown away that this man says this to me so clearly and knows this is Arthur Schick. And he leans in and he says to me, I know that Arthur Schick was not an observant Jew. He says, but every time I look at the calligraphy in Schick's Hagaddah, I know that he's a man with a deep Jewish soul. That's what this man said to me. I was like blown away. And so, yeah, a deep, deep Jewish soul.
Mm-hmm. Any plans for Schick's birthday?
It's
coming up in a few days.
Yeah, Schick's birthday, every June 3rd, there's another couple, and my wife and I, we get together to celebrate Schick's birthday. We go out to dinner. So every year we do that. And we drink Chopin vodka, which we learned to love when we were once in Poland together. And we usually do that. It turns out right at this present moment, my friend and his wife are in Israel. So when they come back in June, we'll get together still this month, and we always celebrate his birthday. And I used to tell his daughter that. She loved it.
Irv, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate the time.
Oh, Gil, thanks for this opportunity. I loved it. Thanks.
And that was Irvin Ungar. His National Jewish Book Award-winning book is Arthur Schick, Soldier in Art, published by Ungar Historicana. It's an impressive book with some great essays, an intro by past guest Stephen Heller, and a vast amount of Schick's art beautifully reproduced. Now, Irv isn't active on social media, near as I can tell, but you can visit Schick.com to find a menu link about him there with info about his essays, books, and presentations on Schick. And Schick.com is a great resource overall for finding more about Arthur Schick. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that's spelled S-Z-Y-K. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Irv, so, who you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one features 40 minutes of new material from Dave McKean, Paul Karasik, Mark Newgarden, Seymour Quast, John Leland, Ann Hulbert, Henry Wessels, Lauren Weinstein, Jerry Beck, Willard Spiegelman, Levi Tadar, Jesse Scheidlauer, and Robert Weil. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I keep putting off, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this episode in New York City the same afternoon as Sandy McClatchy's memorial service, which I talked about in recent episodes. So I parked way uptown and took a subway down. That means like $12 for the toll at the George Washington, $6 for subway, and $15 for parking, along with a couple of bucks for coffee. And if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Michael Hacker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, Michael Janizik, and Stephen Solomon for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. Next week's guest will be the great writer, thinker, and book accumulator, Alberto Manguel. Until then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.